So let me explore this a little bit. In the study of economic growth, ultimately what we're trying to explain is this: real GDP per capita. Now we know from the work we did on GDP that GDP itself is a very complex measure of economic activity, and it has this extraordinary characteristic of representing three things simultaneously: production, income and expenditure. Think about it as income for what we're about to do. And then it starts to make sense why we focus on real GDP per capita as our measure of long-run economic growth. What we're ultimately trying to understand is what determines the average flow of income per person in the economy. So our analysis of GDP in this instance is very much a story about trying to understand the income that is available per person in the economy. Now, real GDP per capita is simply defined as the flow of GDPY divided by the population. Turns out that just working with this gives us some pretty profound insights into the nature of economic growth and what some of these fundamental sources of growth might be. To explain this, I want to introduce a new piece of notation: the letter capital N. Now, the letter capital N I'm going to use to denote the labour force in the economy. So the total amount of labour that is available to produce the output in the economy. Now, why is that useful? Take our real GDP per capita, and now I'm going to do what is a fairly basic mathematical trick, but it's actually going to provide us with extraordinary insight, because I'm going to write that real per capita GDP in a slightly different but nonetheless equivalent way. So take real GDP and divide it not by population but by the labour force. Multiply that by the labour force divided by the population. Now, you can see that I've really not done anything at all, because the labour force on the numerator here and the labour force on the denominator there will simply cancel each other out. So on the right-hand side, all I've done is written real per capita GDP exactly the same as on the left-hand side. But I've broken it up in a particular way to highlight what macroeconomists believe are the two fundamental sources that ultimately are responsible for economic growth. Let's take this one first: Y divided by the labour force. What that represents is the average amount of GDP, the average amount of aggregate production produced per worker. And the term that economists give for that is average productivity. On average, how much does each worker in the economy produce? And that's what we mean by average productivity. This term, N divided by the population, you can almost think of that as a demographic variable. It's representing the proportion of the nation's population that are actively engaged in productive work. So what proportion of your population is in the labour force? In the labour force meaning actively contributing to the production of GDP. And so what we're actually looking at here is something pretty profound. It's an insight that says at a very deep fundamental structural level, if you want to understand what is determining the average amount of real GDP per person, the average income per person in the economy, it's going to be as a result of the interaction of two very important economic variables. The first, average productivity, how much output can each person in the labour force produce, and secondly, how many people do you actually have producing output? So at a very, very sort of basic level, average productivity is how well are your workers able to produce output, and the proportion of the population working is how many workers do you have available to produce output. And all of the explanations that macroeconomists look at to explain long-run economic growth, including the ones that we are going to be focusing on in our course, essentially focus on either one or other, and sometimes both, of those two fundamental factors. Most attention is directed to this one, average productivity. And there's been a lot of empirical work that suggests that that's probably the most important of these two factors. But this is not to neglect demographic factors, though in the theories of economic growth that we're going to consider, our focus is very much going to be on average productivity.